That's pretty gross. Welcome back to the wet coast. It's been a minute since I worked on the Forge, the 1950 Ford F1 hybrid with a Dodge 2500 project, and I think I'm going to take care of that. What I need to do, stab an engine in its engine bay with a transmission behind it that actually changes gears and has a reverse. This is the old engine and transmission that came from the 1950 Ford F1. The engine is pretty hurt. Cylinder 2 has no compression. The engine won't idle. It runs pretty rough. That's the transmission. It's a C4 transmission. Seems to have forward gears-ish. Doesn't have a reverse gear, so imagine the friction discs are burned up or something. I'll take it apart and rebuild it at some point. And this is the engine that's going to go into the F1 so I can get it through inspection. It's also a 302. It's also the same year as the one that was in the F1. It's a 1972. It's a stout engine. I pulled it out of my Ford Maverick. You can see that in a different video. Link in the description, of course. There's a transmission that was behind it. Also a C4. Originally behind a 6-cylinder, so a slightly lighter version of the C4, but I'll fix that and it'll be fine. I don't plan on pushing this engine too much. What I need to do is swap out this high-rise manifold with the 2-barrel manifold that's on the original engine. That high-rise manifold is a little bit too extreme for the street, and I just want a streetable engine for this project. Ah, that's a lot of metal. Anyways, time's a wasting. Time to get at it. So, I'm going to give this a quick kiss with the pressure washer before I take that manifold off. Alright, well that's it for today. I've got the engine on the stand. I'm getting ready to work on it. I've got to fix this frost plug, pull off the manifold. Got it on the engine stand. It's ready to go. I'll continue this tomorrow because just like that, it's the next day. So now it's time to pull the manifolds off these engines. I'm going to start with the Mavericks 302, so let's get at it. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull the distributor off. So what I've done is I've rotated the engine so that the #1 piston is at top dead center. That way when I have to put the distributor back in, it's going to be a lot easier to find cylinder 1 and get the ignition going right away. I have got a replacement distributor for this engine. I just bought one off of Amazon. I'll put a link in the description. It's an all-in-one unit that has the pickup, and we'll just drive a coil. So that's all I needed for this pickup truck. This one's a Mallory high-performance one. It requires a CDI box or a spark box, whatever you want to call it, and I don't want to bother wiring that into the old F1, so just going to replace this distributor. So next thing after that, undo all the bolts, pull the manifold off. And out with the old. Even after all these years, the inside of this engine looks pretty good. I'll need to remove the old intake gaskets. I have a brand new gasket set for this engine. But for now, I'm just going to push this out of the way and go get the manifold off the donor engine. The donor engine being the old F1 engine. And I need the intake manifold for it. And out with the old. Oh, that's heavy. Holy smokes. Let me just point out the style of ignition this old engine had. Progress. I used a fine grit wheel on my grinder just to get the mating surface where the gasket sits nice and clean. I'm going to put a little RTV silicone on there as well. I did the same thing on the manifold behind me, and now I'm going to start putting things together, flip the engine over, and fix the frost plugs. Brand new 302 gasket set. I bought the whole kit with the intent of maybe one day rebuilding the engine, but really all I need is the intake gaskets, the exhaust gaskets, and these are down here. And there's the head gaskets if I actually want to rebuild the engine. So put this all together. You look carefully, this one says head side, so if you buy gaskets, just check for that because it's pretty important which way these go on. I always like to stick a bit of RTV in these corners because these tend to leak on most engines if the gasket doesn't sit perfectly in there or get squished enough. Do it on both sides. Doesn't hurt anything. And on with the manifold. Always use your torque wrench and follow the recommended torque values for your engine. Time to get to the frost plugs on this engine, and then I can start reassembling the forge. It's exciting. Got the engine rolled over on the engine stand, and I'm taking out these two rubber frost plugs. I've never seen this kind before. Maybe they're standard, maybe they're not, but this one is obviously popped and there's a lot of corrosion around it. So I'm gonna pull them out, clean up this area, reinstall a couple new brass ones that I picked up off of Amazon, and then this engine won't leak anymore, fingers crossed. Oh, also, these are 13mm nuts, which is really weird. Yuck. Ugh, that's yuck. I'm gonna have to vacuum that out. Looks like there's silicone around it too, so I want as little as that junk to fall into the cooling passages as possible. I'll vacuum that out, pull the other one out. Hopefully it's not as bad. I think I'm gonna have to give this a coolant system flush once I get it all together. There's a load of scale in there. Is that a bad thing? I hope not. I'm gonna have to pull it out with a magnet. Just a little rare earth magnet taped to a popsicle stick. I think at some point in the past this block has been run without proper coolant in it, which means that there was no rust inhibitors. So I'm getting a lot of rust off the inside of the block. Part of it, of course, is the actual back plate of that frost plug. Okay, the rest of that's small enough that it can move through the cooling system without jamming anything up, and I'll flush it all out. Yahtzee! That one's not so bad. It's a bit of scale down there, but clean it all out. Small stuff, just powder. That'll flush out once I get the engine running. Alright, so I've got all the scale and rust out of there that I can, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to clean up these edges with my Dremel. This one isn't too bad, but I'm going to clean it up anyways and try and smooth this out. I'll be reinstalling the frost plugs with a bit of RTF silicone around it just to ensure there's a good seal. I don't think this block is too far gone that it won't work, so let's get at it. Just like that. So to install these, I'm just going to use a socket reversed on an extension. This is a 1-inch. It just about fits perfectly. It's good enough. I'm going to put it on there. I'm going to have some RTF around there, put some in there as well, and just whack it with a hammer. And because hardened steel on hardened steel, make sure you wear your safety glasses because there's a non-zero chance of chips flying off your hammer. That would be a bad thing if you don't have eye protection on. Oops. RTV, not RTF. WTF though, for sure. And that is that. So on the other side of the engine, it looks like this one has been pushed out slightly and it's been weeping. I can see like the corrosion. Yeah, that's been weeping a little bit. So I'm going to replace this one. This one is bulged, as so is this one. So I'm going to replace all three of these just to be on the safe side, because I don't want this leaking once the engine's back in. Sometimes it's a never-ending story. So for these, just take a decent sized punch. You can use just about anything and just smack it on one side and it should pivot out. Like that. Oh, look at that. This one's got a hole in it, so I'm glad I went ahead to change these out. I'm going to do them all. I'm going to flip the engine over. I'm going to do the other frost plugs too, because I don't know if they're as bad as this one. Again, there's a lot of debris in there. I'm just going to sweep it out with a magnet. Okay, I have all 6 frost plugs on the block replaced. The ones on the head I'm not too worried about. They look fine, and the reason why I'm not overly worried about them on this engine is because any residual water that was sitting in the block is going to be sitting down in these low points. This engine was not stored with any coolant in it or any water, so these would have been high and dry. They should be fine. I guess what happened was at some point the cooling system was flushed and only pure water was put in there. So no coolant means no anti-corrosion ability and rusted out frost plugs. So lesson learned on this block, don't go cheap with the frost plugs. I was only going to replace the 2 that looked kind of janky, the rubber ones. I guess at some point in the car's history somebody had busted out a frost plug and they bought the cheap rubber ones because they didn't want to pull the engine to do the job properly. I was only going to replace those 2, and when I started looking around I saw that at least 3 of them were corroded right out, but they didn't show on the outside. So if I had to put this engine back inside the forge and fired her up, I would have blown those out just from pressure in the cooling system when the engine got hot. So good thing I did all that. Next thing I'm going to do now is get the engine in, but well, I guess not quite the next thing, because the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a plate so I can lift this engine up properly with my tractor. As you know from the previous stuff I've shown in this video, is that I've just been anchoring chain across the manifold here, but I don't want to mess with my torque settings on these outside bolts again, because the manifold is all torqued on. I'm going to quickly fabricate a plate that's going to go on the intake here. I'll be able to lift up the whole engine. I've got a load balancer, which is going to make it easier to just tilt the engine forward and backwards. I'll get to that and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Now I've got an engine hoist plate that mounts right where the carburetor goes. This is going to be plenty strong enough to hold this engine up in the air. And I've got another tool from my workshop. This will come in handy with other 2-barrel engines with the same bolt spacing. Alright, I'm pretty happy with this. This is going to work well, hoisting the engine up in the air and getting it installed into the forge. And I thought this was going to be the last thing I needed to do before I could put this engine in. Remember I said there was one last thing I needed to do before the other one last thing? Well, I was wrong. There is one more last thing I need to do, and that is to get the headers mounted on the engine. These are the headers off the Maverick. They're pretty tight fit in the Maverick because it's such a small car. And I think there's plenty of room in the forge for me to use these. So what I'm going to do is put them on the engine before I actually try to put this engine in the engine bay. That's a lot of engine. So I'm going to try it. If it works out, great. If not, I'll just have to use the cast iron manifolds. So nothing to it but to try it. Alright, I'm calling this done. It's just about ready now to get put back into the truck. So I made this attachment in a previous video. I've got the link down in the description if you want to check it out, and boy is it making my life so much easier. I made this plate so I can carry the engine around, no problem, and wow, pretty happy with this. And it looks like I can get it high enough now to get it over and into the engine bay of the Forge without having to deflate the tires, which is a nice little time saver. When you're doing this kind of stuff solo and you're moving around heavy stuff, every little bit helps, and I'm sure glad I made this thing. So now let's get this engine in there. Well, that went so smooth, it was as if I'd planned it, and there's no chance of that. But I'm gonna take it. Everything fits fine. Lots of room for the headers on either side of the frame rails. It clears the steering box, and the motor is now sitting on top of the motor mounts. I haven't yet bolted them down, but I'm gonna do that now. But let me show you how well things fit so far. So you can see I've got about a ½ an inch between the header tube there and the steering column. I've got lots of room around the steering box, etc. Tons of room between the rest of the motor and the frame rails and the motor mounts. On the other side, it's even better. Lots of room between where the battery box goes, the frame rails, motor mounts. Plenty of clearance down there. That's the original Maverick pulley on there. I'm probably going to pull it off and put the one that was on the engine that used to be in here. Now my only concern, and I'm going to go down there and check because I got to put on the motor mount bolts, is how well those headers down there are going to clear the transmission mount. So let's go have a look. So at first glance it looks like there's lots of room for the headers to clear underneath this transmission mount here. But I know the engine is sort of tipped back right now on the motor mounts because one, I haven't bolted them back in, and two, the transmission is not attached, and that's going to lift the back end of the motor up when it sits on top of the mount. So there's a pretty good chance that those headers are actually going to come out right where this motor mount or this transmission mount is, and I'm just going to have to fabricate a new one. It's not a big deal. It's only a little bit of time and effort, right? Taking my transmission for a walk. Gonna install it in an old truck. Oh man, I can't sing. Better not quit my day job. Okay, it's getting serious now. I'm gonna throw a little Type F transmission fluid in the torque converter just to make sure it can prime the pump when the engine starts. Of course, I have to make my traditional Exxon Valdez levels of oil spill when I do this. And it's in. This is the fun part. Installing a transmission solo. Do have a little bit of a secret weapon though, a motorcycle lift. Now I just need to get the transmission on top of it. All right. Thought I would be able to slip them past the header, so I don't know. Well, I think I have no choice, but I'm gonna have to remove the right-hand header. Well, that's a bummer. All right, I've got the right-hand side header removed from the engine. I've got plenty of room now. It's time to hop on the struggle bus and get this transmission installed. Old vehicles are sometimes known to have a little bit of oily dirt buildup. Sometimes. Check it out, transmission's mounted, all connected. I even snuck in a new transmission mount because in the previous video I showed you it wasn't even connected. It had just disintegrated. And it looks like I've got plenty of room to sneak my exhaust underneath the mount. I was really worried I wouldn't have clearance, but this is great. I think the only thing left to do now is install the drive shaft and I can go start doing smoky burnouts. Let's go check my task list and see if that's true. Oh, shit. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.